But one point that you made that I think is kind of the core of all of that, you said it requires invention and reinvention constantly. And that's a really interesting challenge for every company, because change is hard in any environment, particularly in a multinational, multi-corporate, multi-business environment. So what do we do about that? And it's no surprise, therefore, that you hear so many governments and so many business stressing the importance of innovation all the time. And it's become, in Singapore where I live, innovation and encouraging innovation is an obsession with the government now. They can't think of enough ways to try and inspire this. So to that end, let's get our next speaker up to address this particular issue. Innovating for the Future is by Professor Francis Davis, who's the UK's Ministerial Advisor on Inclusive Enterprise. He's also a Professor of Innovation at St Mary's University and Professor of Public Policy at the University of Birmingham.
It's very good to be here, and I'd just like to pay tribute to the organisers for putting today on, and I look forward to something similar in London that perhaps jointly we can organise. And it's been very interesting for me to spend time with the British Deputy High Commissioner yesterday, listening to her insights and those of her team, and to have the honour of meeting with the Governor yesterday. In fact, we were talking about, at the back end of that meeting, the horrors of making speeches, and I was telling him of a story that one of our foreign secretaries used to tell about an Australian foreign secretary who went to the Middle East to try and initiate an Australian resolution to the Israeli-Palestine conflict. But he did so having fallen out with his wife and with his staff. And so he arrived at this keynote address with his text before him prepared by his staff. And he began the words, "I come from Australia to help initiate a major resolution to the problems of the Middle East." And having upset his wife and his team, he turned to the next page, and it just said, "You're on your own now, good luck." Now, this won't be happening today. I really want to talk about the snow in the hot place of Pakistan, not the snow as we know it, but in terms of this small toy that some of you may have seen if you've ever been to a place that sells these things. It's something that gets sold in the UK. You shake it up around the toy, and it raises all the snow into the air. And sometimes the fall of the snow, when it drops back down again, falls in a sensible place. Sometimes it gets spread out. But it seems to me, as we're looking at the leadership challenges around innovation, and particularly the leadership challenges around innovation in societies that face social, economic, environmental, and other challenges that are fresh, as much as the technology is fresh, we need to keep shaking the snow up and looking for new ways to lay it down again in different ways. Now, I approach this as an academic based at St Mary's University in Twickenham, and I spend part of my week there in London, that great city with so many links to this country, and part of my week in Birmingham, that great city with so many links to this city. In the last few days, we've launched, in partnership with SEED, who are a collaborator in today's event, a new international centre on social innovation and global public service. And Jorrit de Jong from Mayor Bloomberg's Cities Initiative, who's working with 40 of the world's mayors, came to launch that for us at Lambeth Palace. Alongside and above and around my academic work, I've had the privilege of working with a number of ministers and mayors. So Sadiq Khan, you know, will be here shortly, visiting Lahore, Islamabad, and Karachi, and I did some work with his predecessor. The man on the right of Sadiq Khan there, you might not know, Mayor Andy Street, is the new city mayor of the city of Birmingham, the former managing director of the John Lewis Partnership, one of our great entrepreneurs and one of our great business leaders, and he, too, is leading a regional revival in that city. So think of it, Sadiq, a politician and a representative of a vital community to British future, Andy Street, an entrepreneur, bottom left-hand corner, Greg Clark, our current Secretary of State for Business, an intellectual coming out of a university and a consulting background. And then Penny Mordaunt, who I work with at the moment, the Minister focused on inclusion in the economy and disabilities. And Penny has a military background, coming from the great military city of Portsmouth. From one, you get community roots, Sadiq Khan. From the other, you get entrepreneurial skills, Andy Street. From Greg Clark, you get the power of the intellect and the power of universities. And then from Penny, you get that ability to understand the motivation of people, the unlocking of the disciplined and very sophisticated organizing and planning potentials of the military. And these are all things that shape and contribute to some of the comments I'm about to make. And of course, I haven't only tried to write about some of these things, I've tried to do them too. As a young man, I was foolish enough to agree to go and try and turn around a business that was losing £1,000 every 10 minutes. It was a major manufacturing company in the printing industry. By the time we finished, it's a digital company that sells content in Britain, and all of its manufacturing arms have been relocated to Asia. As a young man, a group of us were so frustrated with the care for the elderly in our cities, where family fracture is so poorly, that we launched a venture which provides care for the elderly and those who are disabled, which now and today employs 1,000 staff. Interesting that at the front end of that venture, we relied solely on low-cost human labor, and at the back end of that venture, we were visiting science parks in China, where 20% of the investment is now going on developing technology and assistive technology to replace human carers with digital, with robotic carers for those who will be elderly and frail, the growing part of the world's humanity in the future. The US State Department estimates the future value of that assistive tech industry at over $100 billion just in the US, let alone the other parts of the world. And on the bottom left there, spent some time in the early 90s in Bosnia, working with Muslim women who'd been ferociously treated by those who had attacked them, seeking to do with tiny amounts of money, huge things in the midst of that crisis. And of course, today I'm working with disabled people like John Willis, seen there with one of our current business ministers. John Willis, born with no arms and no legs, could sometimes be put into a box as having nothing to add. He's founded something like 40 firms, the smallest of which now turns over 50 million, and he calls himself a short man with a massive attitude. And I come to all of these things together because, of course, the thing that terrifies an academic is not can it work in practice, but once you've worked out how it works in practice, how on earth does it work in theory? It's that backfill. Now, what does it seem to me, based on that practical background and the research teams that I have working around the place and my visits to firms, that are crucial challenges for the future? Well, of course, we know about the major infrastructural challenges: water and sanitation, transportation, health, education, and youth entrepreneurship. These are the big challenges that any megacity, Karachi now a megacity, any new and emerging economy faces. Any economy like Pakistan that's coming out of some tough times, now becoming one of the world's generative leaders. And I just want to focus in within that, though, on the educational potential. Because it seems to me that in a place like Karachi, where you have a lot of universities, a place like London, where we have a lot of university, a place like Coventry, where 10% of the jobs now rely on 2 universities, that our old histories lacked a lot of disciplined attention to the way that we imagine the future. We end up with some striking innovation bursting out of a part of government or the private sector or civil society, and we go, wow, we did it, but we never really thought how we did it. Now, of course, one way that we did it was to recognize that rocket science is often a distraction. The Eddie Stobart company based in the UK had the rocket science idea of simply making their trucks look nice and their staff dress smartly, and this transformed their reputation because they were providing something clean. On the back of that, they've been able to diversify into a whole series of other business areas, including technology. Often enough, it seems to me, in unlocking skills and talent and educational potential, and that's where I want to focus, we really haven't looked hard enough for inspiration. At the University of Birmingham, we now have our own schools. The University of Northampton in the UK has a chain of schools, and they will work with schools in the very poorest neighbourhoods, bringing children into the university campus from the age of 10, 11, 12, and then offer them a guaranteed place at 13, 14 for when they're 18, so that those kids can have their aspiration lifted, can be on a campus and not feel frightened, and can be mentored through into the system. And the mentoring is key. The tutor trust, a very striking social innovation that's gone out the door recently in terms of developing talent, takes the most talented students from the best universities and in their spare time pays them to go into the most challenging schools and to mentor the young children with their maths and their education, and they're supported by corporates to do so. The Cristo Rey School, which was first trialled in the Bronx and has now been rolled out to about 150 localities, is more interesting still, because it noticed that lots of people couldn't go to school because they were having to work to keep their family going. Lots of people wouldn't stay in school because truancy was a challenge. So they created a school that worked, which is to say that in the very poorest part of the Bronx, you go into school and by a special exception in labor law, you do 3.5 to 4 days study, very vocationally focused, and 1 day of your week is 1/5 of a real job. So you go to the post room in a bank and you work in 1/5 of a job. And on other days, 4 other students on a rota come to the post room and they do 1/5 of a real job. Or it could be in the hospital, or it could be in a consulting firm. This means that 1 real job gets done in that bank, in that firm, in that health center. The family has income from that work. In fact, the family doesn't have to pay the school fees because the fees are 70% funded by the real wages paid by the corporates for the work. The young people, when they're 18, 19, 20, graduate, and they have a reference from a company that they could never dream of having a company reference from, and they've got friends and they've got relationships and they've got networks to build their career in the future from that they would never have dreamed of having. And of course, it comes down, really, in lots of other ways to the way you apply the technology to improving that. Hills Are Evil is an amazing little app that's been created in the city of Bristol. Hills Are Evil is a simple thing where on your mobile phone, you can download a map of your city. It's an overlay on the map of your city. So if you're in a wheelchair or you're disabled, you can go from one side of a shopping mall to another without going up the steps, down the steps, or up the escalator. You can get from one side of the hospital to the other without facing that kind of challenge. Street Bump in the city of Boston took the same technology, and this is where the unlocking of the technological power to harness new innovations comes into its real own, not just in the private sector, but also in building the capacities of government and of civil society as well. Street Bump is a little app given away by the mayor of Boston to the voters of Boston, and of course, you think it's a big issue there. I mean, it wouldn't be something they'd be worried about in Africa, but the quality of the roads, as drivers drive around the city of Boston, every time they go over a major crack in the road, it sends back a GPS location of where the crack in the road is to City Hall. Okay, so it's just crowdsourcing, isn't it? Except that it cut the cost to the City Hall of identifying where the broken roads were by 1/3, and as a result of that, they could plan their overtime better, which reduced the cost of doing the overtime and the fixing of the roads by 40%. And with the money that they saved, the mayor was then able to invest in some of the poorest neighborhoods in building the capacity and skills of adults and kids that couldn't go to work. So we don't look hard enough for inspiration, because when we do, we unlock new dimensions altogether. We don't look hard enough at our customers, very briefly. We tend to feel comfortable with those customers we know quite well, and not the really, really demanding customers who teach us so much about what we're doing. And the thing about technology is we can capture their feedback much more quickly than we've ever done before. I was very struck the other day to be with the Prime Minister's office in UAE, and as part of their national happiness strategy, they're installing customer feedback points in almost every single public service outlet. So the Prime Minister in due course will be able to have a happiness board, a happiness dashboard right in front of him, finding out where his most demanding and least demanding voters, citizens' feedback points are. Seems to me we need to go there first to be able to improve our systems. And perhaps most challenging of all is that point where we say, how do we work across the sectors? We reach for the silos of government, we dive into the corporate world. We don't want to go looking for innovation in the social space. Mayor Andy Street at the moment, on the 27th of November, is convening a huge summit of the 9 major religious communities that you find in the city of Birmingham, with, of course, Islam at its heart, bringing together people that wouldn't normally meet, like I'd never met Amrit Singh, my co-chair of that event, until he brought this together. I've discovered that there are more varieties of Sikh than there are kinds of vegetable in the process. I mean, I knew the Muslim community well, but one of the things that we're looking at is the economic contribution to those communities, the diaspora contribution to those communities, and of course the reality that zakat and the behaviors around zakat in the Muslim community make the British Muslim community statistically the most generous in their country, but probably the community where the debate about how you apply the use of that generosity most innovatively, to be able to sweat it, to do the most sorts of things to challenge poverty, is most underdeveloped. We need to bring our alliances together to unlock fresh potential so that, for example, in Indonesia, Bangka and Dara didn't take the usual approach of building up 35 credit unions every 4 or 5 years, as some civil society organizations would do. No, they thought more ambitiously. They went to Bill Gates and they said, give us 100 million from your challenge fund. They matched that with investors. This is a civil society initiative, not a classic banking initiative. 100 million from Bill Gates, 100 million maxed in civil society. They went to Indonesia, and instead of starting lots and lots of mini credit unions over 100 years, they bought a bank and changed all of the criteria that the bank would operate by. They're now replicating that into Mongolia. It's a social solution that was only possible because of technology and because of the bringing together of skills of several sectors in one place. And do you know what? Historically, we've asked really strange things of government. Government, give us a handout. Government, give us a check. Government, do something for us. It seems to me that where government really works well, it has to reinvent itself as a convener. It needs to nudge, not command. It needs to collaborate and co-produce ideas using technology to do that so that it doesn't get lost. And of course, throughout all of this, if we're going to innovate, we need to survive as managers. As an entrepreneur, lots of people say to me that the first thing you gain when you found a firm is your freedom, and the first thing you lose is your freedom. So resilience is underrated. Albie Sachs was blown up whilst trying to set the people of South Africa free. He ended up as the first chairman of the law courts after the freedom election, writing the Constitution of South Africa, despite the fact that he now has no limbs. My friend John there, with no limbs, talks about the times that he's had to keep going, to the point that he couldn't travel, and one day just set out on a journey to prove that he could, and he traveled all the way around the world. And he talks about founding a firm and growing a firm as going around the world. Across sectors, mobilizing the technology and making sure that that spirit of resilience remains within us is a crucial way, it seems to me, of maintaining spark, having a disciplined and outcome-centered imagination, and making sure that when the snow falls and drops, we're not working with the bottom end of the snow, but with the top 10 places in your country and beyond that you can find snow. Thanks for listening.
Professor, thank you for a detailed and interesting. There's a lot to unpack there, but it strikes me that actually amid all of that, you bowled a bit of a googly. A bit of a googly. I mean, in a good way, because here we are talking about the application of high technology into old business spaces.